Hello everybody, I'm George from Ireland. Here I am in London, the Chalk Farm area, and behind me is the house of Leslie Hutchinson. That tree slightly in the way, you can maybe see the blue plaque through the branches since the tree has shed its foliage, it being the autumnal season. But so Les Hutchinson, or Leslie Hutchinson is his correct name, was born in 1900, so an easy year to remember. Born in Grenada, that's an island in the Caribbean. One of the Windward Islands. It was then a British colony. He was black. Of course, his ancestors had been abducted from Africa some centuries earlier and conveyed across the ocean the most inhumane conditions and forced to toil under the broiling sun, under the threat of the lash. But anyway, were free since the 1830s. So he's from a middle-class family in Grenada, and he completed schooling. A lot of people didn't have much schooling at all in Grenada back in those days. And later he moved to New York City, and he's considering reading medicine. He was 16 years old, but I don't think he had started college yet. He had some relatives already living in the United States. But he was a gifted pianist and singer from a very early age. And because of his talent for the gay science, he decided to make a living that way, and he soon dropped the idea of qualifying as a medical man. Anyway, he was very well known in New York in the early 1920s. It was the Roaring Twenties, the jazz age, and African American music was going mainstream. Jazz originally being an African American genre, but adopted and imitated by whites as well. So he was in demand amongst high society in New York, and he had multimillionaires hiring him, famously the Vanderbilt family, who'd made their fortune in the railways, or railroads perhaps I should say, it being the United States. And then in 1924 he shifted to Paris, so there was a small American community there. George Gershwin, Take a Bow, for instance, and Paris was in some ways the cultural capital of the world. Obviously New York was important, and Hollywood had got going back then, so there were very few black people in France, including from the French colonies back then. He spoke very little French at the beginning, but he got fairly good at it after a while. Then he made regular trips to London, where he became known by the movers and shakers of the London entertainment world. He'd released a number of records, because records had just come out, these huge black discs. And that you put those on a record player with a needle. It was a bit scratchy, but that played the tune, and they were very expensive, even though the sound quality was dreadful by contemporary standards. Anyway, and he appeared in a number of films, and he sometimes provided the backing music for films, even though he wasn't actually shown in them. But yes, he was credited, even though he wasn't performing. So he's pretty much an all-rounder. He was very suave, debonair, bonhomous, always immaculately turned out. Quite a slender man as well. He got married in the early 1920s to an African American, and because they had a child, he eventually had 8 children by 7 different mothers. So he had a very complicated and colourful private life. He was also bisexual, so he had a number of intimate liaisons with men. I don't know where his heart ever was in all this. And he came to the attentions of Lord and Lady Mountbatten. That's Lord Louis Mountbatten, who subsequently became the final Viceroy of India. So he was married to that very wealthy banking heiress, Edwina Mountbatten. And he's rumoured to have had an extramarital affair with her, because the Mountbattens had an open marriage. They had 2 daughters. Lady Mountbatten apparently became pregnant by one of her American paramours and had an abortion, but I think that was a bit later. And then it leaked out in the press. There were some stories suggesting that he'd been committing adultery with Lady Mountbatten, so she sued for libel. They both denied it, and there was a big payout, because so the Mountbattens had a very happy marriage, as Lord Mountbatten said, very happy marriage, because they were hopping out of other people's beds all the time, and they just accepted that completely open marriage. And there was no envy, there was no resentment about its infidelity. But that really sort of wrecked his reputation. A lot of people gave him the cold shoulder, kept him at arm's length after that, and his career severely suffered. He'd been like the hottest ticket in town till the mid-1930s, and then the invitations to perform dried up. You can see he was doing pretty well to have such a fantastic large house here in Chalk Farm, a very desirable area. Remember, the black community, even in London, was tiny. You know, the UK was about 0.1% non-white. It might have been 1% in London. Some of those people would be of South Asian ancestry or Chinese ancestry, something like that. So there was still a lot of racism at the time. It often wasn't just hostility, just big ignorance about black people, because there was such a small number that nobody felt threatened by them. It's later that was white anxiety kicked in, and some of the knuckle draggers said, oh, they're taking over, they're too many. But that couldn't really be argued in the 1930s. So he lived on the rest of his life in obscurity. He died in 1969. He's laid to rest in Highgate Cemetery, not too far from here. Only 42 people showed up for his obsequies, which shows you how little known he was. Yeah, he outlived Lady Mountbatten by quite some time. If he had done an affair with her, he would have been all right. Oh, and looking this way, look. You can see with the city. Oh, you can't make out the silhouette with the naked eye, but I can. I can see the Swiss Ray building, the Gherkin. That's enough for me. So follow me on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook, TikTok. You've got to go on all these things and book me for lessons in elocution, accent reduction, public speaking, history, politics, law, religious studies, citizenship, French, English as a foreign language, English literature, and so on. I'm a tour guide here in Londinium, and I help you with essays, dissertations, theses, things of that nature, interview practice. All right, toodaloo.